it because they want to read it. You have their attention, so use the space freely. You have no need to be counting words or pages. You can feel free to digress and give it all you've got. The Price of Prosperity hit the bookstores in the spring of 1962. On publication date, my wife and I went out to celebrate with lunch at a fancy restaurant, including the appropriate number of martinis to match the occasion. Easter was about 10 days off, and, on the way home, we saw a gray and white rabbit in a pet shop. We were in such a jolly mood we walked into the pet shop, bought the rabbit, and took him home. We named him Prospero, after the Price of Prosperity. Prospero was the first in a long line of pet rabbits who graced our lives over many years. This book has also inspired its own line of descendants, each of which has brought its own special flavor of joy and excitement. 9 more books have followed The Price of Prosperity, including 2 co-authored with my late and beloved friend, Robert Heilbroner. The primary message of The Price of Prosperity is in the profound difference between projections and forecasts. We can put together all kinds of statistical material from the past to describe the future. If we are gloom mongers, we produce projections of disastrous scenarios. If we are incurable optimists, we can paint beautiful pictures of a glorious future. All we have to do is choose the desired set of historical statistics and get to work. The Price of Prosperity refers to this process as economic arithmetic. The book's mission is to test out the necessary conditions for the fulfillment of the wildly optimistic long-run projections that were popular in 1960 to 1961 when I was writing the book. Based on economic arithmetic, these projections combined firm expectations for sharply improving labor productivity with the impending accelerated growth in the labor force as the baby boomers reached working age. The result of these calculations was a glittering promise of higher living standards by the mid-1970s. The search for the necessary conditions to make those dreams come true was not an easy one. At that moment, the baby boomers were still too young to be entering the labor force. The oldest were in their mid-teens. The cohort received plenty of attention nevertheless, as all groups of young people receive attention, caused primarily by their social behavior and the strain they impose on their parents' pocketbook. But nobody appeared to be worrying about what would happen when the baby boomers would be old enough to enter the labor force and start looking for jobs. On the contrary, most people figured it would be a relief not to have so many young people acting up, to say nothing of the pleasure of getting them off the family payroll. People do not land jobs just because they are in the job market. Employment expands when the demand for goods and services expands. That condition is never preordained. The problem, then, was as simple as its solution was complex. Sustaining a low level of unemployment as the baby boomers matured would require unprecedented peacetime growth in the demand for goods and services. Demand for higher living standards is always there, but these projections ignored any problems that might arise in generating sufficient incomes to pay for that big jump in the consumption of goods and services. The whole exercise was meaningless unless we could identify the sources of growth in purchasing power. In 1960, the number of people of working age, say ages 20 to 64, was 94 million, just about half the total population. 10 years earlier, the working population had been 89 million. Thus, the number of people of working age had increased by only about 5% since 1950, compared with the growth of nearly 20% in the total population. Under those conditions, sustaining full employment in most years was no problem. But by the end of the 1960s, the oldest of the baby boomers would begin seeking jobs, and that number would grow at an accelerating rate. By 1980, the cohort aged 20 to 64 would grow to about 130 million, an increase of 43% from 1960, while the total population would increase by only 25%. It was clear that a rapid expansion in the demand for goods and services would be essential if the country were to achieve full employment over that 20-year span. After a detailed exploration of the alternatives, I could find no solution to this problem other than an increase in government spending, state and local as well as federal, relative to the economy as a whole.